let me welcome colleagues, panelists, and participants to this fourth session of our web conference on the theme of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on labor and employment. Thus far, our focus has been on the past until the present. So we have considered India at a macro level in terms of responses and trajectories. We have considered beyond the impact at a macro level, impact and strategies with respect to sectors and groups yesterday. And earlier this afternoon, we sought to focus on international experiences. We are in this session going to think forward. What does the future hold in terms of the employment scenario and the future of work in India? We have the good fortune of an extraordinarily distinguished set of panelists who are going to analyze a cross-section of fascinating issues. Now, it is obvious that just as the parts and processes in the post-pandemic era, as well as the outcomes, will differ across countries, they will also differ across states in India, depending very much on the nature of interventions by the government, the responses of the community, and so on.
We also have policies of the Indian government, since we are largely focusing on India. One, the Indian policy of not giving direct support to, say, the SMEs. And we now have reports saying that 30% of the SMEs will not reopen after the lockdown ends. This we are getting from the garment industry, we're getting it from the leather industry, we're getting it from the All India Manufacturers Organization all over. At a very broad level, we had in the value chains, we had two sets of economies. The first are what were known as the headquarter economies, where the lead firms, which were mainly in what we call the global north, and then there are the supplier economies in the global south. But this is now changing, and it is changing very fast. There are now international lead firms, many more from China, a few from India. You know the struggle for the 5G technology. Huawei and the US companies are in a huge battle to see who will dominate the 5G technology. So you have a new rise of global oligopolies. Now, along with that, there is a regionalization of global value chains. Why? Not just global, but regional. Asia, particularly East Asia, is now not just a manufacturer, it's also a market. Therefore, the East Asian value chain is very much a chain by itself. The Asian market, we know, will collapse less than the US and the EU markets, and therefore there'll be even more stress on the regionalization of the Asian value chains. And the third point here is that the US-China strategic conflict, with everybody trying to move towards a kind of onshoring or bringing back home some parts of the value chain. So how will this affect the global value chains? First point is there will be some relocation or onshoring, but we should note that the onshoring will not be with the existing technology. You can't go and manufacture in the USA in any reasonable cost with the sewing machine technology to make garments or t-shirts. You will have to have a highly automated, robotized model of production, which is there. Actually, it is a Chinese firm which in North Carolina is producing robotized t-shirts for 33 cents a piece, which is cheaper than you can produce in Bangladesh. There's an Adidas factory in Germany that with 150 workers produces 500,000 pairs of shoes a year. These are the robotized factories that might come up in the process of reshoring, not the old factories being moved from here, from the south to the north. Now, we've had some number of small changes coming about, which will affect the labor market. This is the use of ICTs in e-commerce, in digital communication, in the work from home. 75% of TCS employees will now work from home. Contactless check-in, remote medical counseling, all of these will not go away. These will reduce the employment intensity of manufacturing and services. This will increase the demand for skilled workers. I wouldn't be surprised if this also increases the proportion of permanent workers in the entire workforce. There is a big new business model coming out of India. This is the growth of mega oligopolies. What do I mean by a mega oligopoly? An oligopoly in more than one consumer market. So that data is used across markets. You have Jio with Reliance Retail. Jio is a telecom company, Reliance is a retail company, and they're going to join together, and they have made it very clear, we want to be everything for all Indians. So you're having now a fight for a new kind of oligopoly. You have Facebook joining with Reliance, you have Amazon joining with, I think, Airtel, and you have Google joining with Vodafone. So we are moving into what is being called by somebody the age of surveillance capitalism, and this is a new form of the business organization which we are going to see.
It looks as though the demand for delivery service has actually increased a lot, but in reality that is not actually what has happened. What you find is there's been a bit of demand probably for delivery more than for ride-hailing platforms, which actually suffered a loss, quite a bit of loss. But even this delivery that was there was to an extent very restricted. The entire control mechanism or regulation of work actually is not done any longer by human, but it is algorithmically managed, which has major repercussions with regard to workers' rights. If work is rejected and you do not know why work is rejected, there's absolutely no mechanism to find out what happened or how they could actually improve work. And because workers are spread across different destinations, there's absolutely no way to collectively organize and have a voice to actually represent their interests or to have any sort of a redressal mechanism, which is a major problem. And it comes out much more starkly during this period. Now, as soon as the COVID happened, what actually the delivery and taxi app companies did was they labeled themselves as providing essential services to society during COVID-19, as there were restrictions on getting out of home. So you had a lot of ride-hailing platforms which no longer got customers to actually carry, so they got into emergency service, providing emergency services, transporting healthcare workers, but they also got into the delivery of grocery, food, and all of it. So there was clear diversification that was happening. If you look at the US labor demand itself for this kind of a job very clearly, you find that there are two categories where it actually increases. One is for technology, that is software services, and the second one is for low-end clerical activity, and the third activity that is actually rising up there is the professional services. But if you look at the labor supply during this period, very clearly you see that it is the software and the creative industry for which the supply is actually increasing. Now, if we turn towards India and try seeing what is happening within the Indian online labor market, it's quite interesting. You find that the labor demand of these kinds of jobs has actually increased since the lockdown. And here very clearly what you see is a shift that is happening, basically where on-site workers are being substituted by online workers. So you see a huge demand for this type of work. And if you look at the supply of workers, again, you see that there is an increase in supply of workers during this period. Now, platform workers have been actually having legal battles with regard to the whole misclassification issue, basically. But during the COVID, what's very interesting to see is that they came up with much more minimalistic measures saying, let's talk about health safety, let's talk about sick pay, let's talk about extra payment or hazard pay, and let's talk about having access to data.
I'll quickly say that a survey of over 1,500 such informal sector workers showed that over 60% of these households have lost their livelihood, 67%. And this has resulted into severe crisis of working capital. Less than 34% have reduced their consumption, so eating habits, food, and therefore women are the worst affected. We also see that education of the children has been affected, and amongst them we see high rate of school dropout of girls, erosion of whatever little assets that these children had. If the small and medium enterprises also, 30% of them cannot revive in spite of having the loan packages, how are these informal sector workers going to survive? And therefore, I think there is a need in countries of the world, especially like India, to adopt a nurturing and caring approach towards the nano and the poor and the tiny micro entrepreneurs and their micro enterprises. Nobody is talking about them or yet even thinking about them. There's a need to streamline existing systems, processes, supply chains, communication channels, and technology in order to position them to meet evolving customer needs. The focus needs to be in ensuring minimal disruptions to the supply chain, making the processes more efficient, and introducing additional technology when necessary. I think one also needs to look at how do you build meso-level organizations that help these tiny and nano enterprises to scale up to be into the mainstream.
Where is the space for labor politics? Now you might say there might be one space opening up for labor politics, which has to do with one big change that we saw over the last 10 or 15 years, which is as the power of labor unions declined, as labor's agitational power declined, the emphasis in our society was to move towards two things. One, to detach welfare rights, right, from workplace rights. So this proliferation of rights, right to employment, right to basic income, various kinds of things. And we thought we would build a welfare state that could make the lives of labor less precarious. Okay? Now, we've seen how much of a welfare state we have built in the last 2 months. When more than 50% of the households in India cannot survive if their wages were shut down for 1 month, right? That's the new CMI survey, right? Where is that welfare state, right? Think of the political implications of what the migrant crisis has in a sense shown, right? If after this crisis, where you put 50 to 60% of your workforce in a state of enforced indignity, there is still no political backlash, right? Where do you think the political constituency for building those worker rights is actually going to come from? Maybe there is another side, which came up over the last 10 to 15 years, which moved more from social movements to accountability. So if you look at civil society discourse, for example, right, in the last 10 to 15 years, much of our effort moved towards saying, look, there are no natural social movements. Social movements are very weak. All kinds of social movements, even agrarian social movements have weakened in some ways. So can we focus our energies on making the state more accountable, right? And one very good example of this, for example, was NREGA, both in terms of the articulation of a new scheme, that's the social welfare dimension. But one of the most interesting things about NREGA, at least in the UPA, was that it mobilized civil society to try and think of accountability mechanisms, right, that would make NREGA effective. Think of, for example, the social audit mania around NREGA, right? Think of the fact that we created enormous data transparency, at least in NREGA, right? Various kinds of accountability mechanisms.
Is the Indian government setting about trying to rebalance the Indian economy through this Atmanirbhar and so on, and make in India a new strategy It seems to imply protection. It seems to be implied that, government-managed things and so on. So I think there is that type of thing. And I'm reminded of Sujit Bhalla's work earlier, where you said low interest rates, low exchange rates, easy credit, and export orientation, which is the sort of the bottom lines of Korean development and the breakthrough. And can we have the same sort of a thing here? Kind of a new mercantilism in some form. I think that this strategy cannot work because the Indian economy itself structurally does not have that capability and flexibility of being able to rebalance itself in quite this way. Secondly, it's dependent, this entire strategy is still dependent on global demand. And this brings us to the elephant in the room, China, and what Dave has pointed out earlier, and I'm sure others have as well, the conflict between China, the trade conflicts between China and the US. If these markets are turning inwards, your global demand possibilities shrink. And so this idea of rebalancing within a global economy actually gets challenged. I would like to suggest that if you think of inequality and you think of the poorer people and the kinds of things they buy, the kind of things they consume, if you want a consumer-driven growth, which is roughly the thing that we have of everybody, that's where we are, then I think the thrust of this extra consumption must really come from the lower sections of society, which means a major redistribution and shifting away from inequality is actually now instrumentally a potential source of growth and a substitute for having to find fiscal transfers for all these mechanisms. It goes back partly to the question of the informal economy and making it productive. But how do you actually do that? It's not so straightforward. But I think that's the kind of a thing that if you shift resources and the purchasing power into the pockets of the lower 50%, agriculture would be one of those things. I think that's where you can have a shifting and rebalancing of the Indian economy. It's a slow process, but I think this is a necessary adjunct of anything else that you're thinking of.